This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Ivy Spohnholz. Ivy is the Alaska State Director at the Nature Conservancy, where she leads the organization's critical work around climate solutions, sustainable fisheries, and resilient communities. Given its size, location, climate, demographics, and economics, Alaska presents a very unique blend of conservation challenges that can directly affect massive landscape-scale ecosystems and the communities within them. We've rarely, if ever, dug into the details of conservation in Alaska on this podcast, so I was thrilled to have Ivy join me for such an in-depth conversation. Ivy was born in a dry log cabin in the remote Wrangell Mountains, in what is now the Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve. Her entire career has revolved around public service. She's held leadership roles at the Salvation Army, University of Alaska Anchorage, Alaska Conservation Foundation, and Abused Women's Aid in Crisis. She also served for more than 6 years in the Alaska House of Representatives, where she honed her skills as a pragmatic and effective problem solver. In the fall of 2022, she took the reins as TNC's Alaska State Director and has been applying her skills as a leader and problem solver toward Alaska's distinctive conservation challenges. I've been lucky enough to visit Alaska on 2 separate occasions, and I've had some of the most formative experiences of my life in the Alaska Range. The size and scale of the mountains, valleys, and wildlife are so staggering that it's impossible to visit Alaska without gaining a deep respect for both the landscapes and the people who live there. So I was excited to have the opportunity to chat with Ivy about her adventurous upbringing in Alaska and her service-oriented career. We talk in detail about her unexpected entrance into politics and how she quickly learned to lead and navigate the lawmaking process as an elected official. We discuss TNC's focus areas in Alaska, and we talk a lot about Bristol Bay and its ecological and economic significance around the world. As you probably come to expect, we talk a lot about the all-important power of relationships, and we also discuss the need to be both practical and optimistic. A huge thank you to Ivy for taking the time to talk with me. I greatly appreciate all of the important work being done by TNC Alaska. Hope you enjoy. Well, Ivy, I'm very, very, very happy to be chatting with you. As we were saying just before we hit the record button, I love Alaska. I've only been up there twice, but I absolutely love it. It's such a amazing, I think the word awesome is overused, but Alaska is awesome. I mean, it is just, it's mind-blowing how big everything is. And when I was preparing for this interview, I was looking at your amazing background, and there was one sentence that stuck out from the first thing I read about you. And it says you were born in a dry log cabin in the Wrangell Mountains. And I think that's really cool. And I want to hear more about that.
Thanks so much. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. This is really fun and really an honor. Yeah, I was born out in this dry log cabin. And for people that don't know what that means there's no running water. There's no toilet. There's an outhouse in the Wrangell Mountains outside of a community called Nebezna, which is really just a collection of cabins in what was then BLM land, but is now part of the Wrangell-St. Elias National Park, which is the largest national park in our country. And it's on kind of close to the Canadian border in the interior of Alaska. It is very, very cold. I was born in January, and I just, my mom was one heck of a woman, man. She's a very gutsy lady.
How did your parents end up there?
My parents, like a lot of immigrant Alaskans, came to Alaska because they were trying to, do something different, to make a new world. That's, I say, Alaska's kind of like the West of the West in a lot of respects like that, in a lot of respects. And this is one of them. Most non-Indigenous Alaskans came here in the 70s and 80s. And my parents came at the beginning of the 1970s. They were interested in doing things a brand new way, wanted to live a subsistence lifestyle, living off the grid and providing, bringing home the food, hunting and fishing, and being independent. They did that. They had a pretty profound experience. I think it's still, a really special time in my mom's life for her. When my parents separated, we moved into Anchorage, which sometimes people call Los Anchorage in Alaska, because it's the big city.
Yeah.
But continue to have really deep connection to rural Alaska. My family also has deep roots in Talkeetna, up north of Talkeetna. My father's family homesteaded up north of Talkeetna at a place called Lane Creek. And when he was young, and that would have been, probably 1960-ish. And so they were living up the railroad tracks from Talkeetna, once again, dry log cabin. And now we're fortunate to have a couple of family properties out there. And my husband and I spend a lot of time at our own dry log cabin, which is also not far from there.
Talkeetna is beautiful. That's the place that I've been both times I've been up to Alaska. And I'm telling you, I thought I understood wide open spaces, and then you get up there in that area, and on a clear day, it gave me a whole new appreciation for what big valleys and big mountains mean. It's stunning up there. So what was your childhood like? I mean, it sounds like your parents and then you were very closely connected to the land. I mean, was outdoors and kind of being in wide open spaces just a big part of your upbringing, even when you were in Anchorage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Anchorage is outdoor. The outdoors has always been a big part of my life in a lot of different ways. We live a very seasonal life in Alaska, where we're the land of the midnight sun, as you probably know, where in the summer our days are really long and people are just getting outside as much as they possibly can in the summertime, hiking and fishing and camping and going, on all sorts of adventures. And my mom and my godmom and my siblings, we would go camping all the time when I was a little girl. And so we were, going up to Denali, and we were, exploring parts of the state that were really amazing and beautiful that take a very long time to get to in many respects. So from where I live in Anchorage to drive to Denali National Park is about a 4-hour drive. And, the town Talkeetna that you hopped off of to get to Denali on an airplane, I would guess, an airplane or a helicopter, is about a 2-hour drive from Anchorage. So everything is really far. And if you look at a map of Alaska, the distance between Anchorage and Talkeetna is like a blip. It's like the back of your pinky. It's like tiny little distance in the state of Alaska. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important to know. And then of course, my mom and stepdad, built a cabin on our family property when I was young. And we have always spent so much time up north of Talkeetna with our family, and have, spent so many Thanksgivings and New Year's, and it's really our second home. Yeah. And, I have 3 adult children, and they grew up going to that cabin. And when my 2 daughters, who have been in the States going to college, come home, they always want to go to the cabin, because that's our intimate family time together, and a real time to get connected to nature and also each other in a way that, the modern world doesn't always provide for. I think it's really, really special.
It's definitely special. It's fun with this, just manically connected world we're in, being able to be together with family or friends in a place where there's no distractions. It's the most valuable thing in the world. I feel like that's why we go camping almost every weekend in the summer, for that very reason. So you go down to Washington State for college. kind of two questions. What was that like, leaving Alaska and kind of being permanently in a more populated area? And then I'd love to know what made you want to go back.
These are great questions. So I actually started college at the University of Utah.
Okay.
Fun kind of random fact. I was a very serious ballet dancer on track to become a professional dancer. And I got a full ride scholarship to the University of Utah. Wow. And so lived there for a couple of years, started my college career there, had a change of heart. After having danced for about 16 years, I decided that's actually not what I wanted to do for my career. I wanted to be more connected to my community. I wanted to be more involved in my community. And so I decided to change my career trajectory and my education plans at that time. My now husband and we met there. So his family is from Utah and we continue to go back there, but we moved to Seattle and lived there while I finished my undergraduate degree, and then kind of launched our careers there before we had our oldest daughter, Iris, who is now 26. And we were like, we'd always planned to come home. I just needed to sow some wild oats. A lot of Alaskan kids need to go to the big city and, try it out a little bit. But it was very clear to me that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to come home to Alaska. And so we came home when she was about 1 and never looked back.
I love that name, Iris, by the way. I think I saw that written out. I was like, that's a beautiful name. Well, another question for you. When I look at your career and everything you've done, I mean, it's so everything is oriented towards serving others, which I think is so admirable. And it seems like you were doing that from the very beginning. I was wondering, where did that come from? I mean, where did that desire to serve others? How did that become such a core part of who you are?
That's a great question. And I really thank you for observing that. It makes my heart sing to know that was so clear to you. And looking at my career, it really came from my parents. My parents were community and public servants. My parents were foster parents when I was young. So I grew up in a family where we had foster children, which really helped me to understand the place of privilege that I had in this world. And then, my father was a police officer.
Oh, so wow.
Another kind of public servant. And then my mom went on to work for, doing parent training, nonprofit work and public sector worked for Governor Tony Knoll, served a brief stint in the Alaska State House in 1989 during a runoff election. So community service and public service were just always a part of our culture. We talked about ideas and service and our individual responsibility to make our world and our communities better, healthier, and stronger.
Did you ever consider anything else, or was that just you were locked in on that all the way through? Because I found it took me a long time to come around to the idea that I needed to be doing purpose-driven work for whatever reason. Right when I got out of school, I was following just kind of a traditional path that a lot of my friends were following and just trying to make as much money as possible. And I didn't really know anything different. And then when I finally moved over to the conservation side of things, I mean, I was late. I was thinking, what took me so long? Like I could never go back at this point, because once you get a taste of that, of doing something that's more important than yourself, it's just amazing. But did you ever even consider anything else?
I really appreciate that, you said you could never go back now. Yeah. I think that having that intersection of your values, your personal values with your work is just really powerful. Like, I need my work to be aligned with my values, and I need to know that I'm, contributing to my community in order to feel as motivated as I can in my work. And I feel that, service does that for me. When I was young, I was a ballet dancer, as we mentioned. And my mom, like, a lot of young parents, saw her her little girl and just thought I was so graceful and wanted to encourage and support that, and never told me what I needed to do or what I should do, never had any expectations about dance, but I was very motivated and did that for a long time, and was on track to become professional. But what I realized as I was sort of coming of age, in that freshman year of college, where you're starting to really think independently about who you are, and I was getting exposed to a lot of ideas in college. I was, taking, sociology and anthropology and political science and languages, and meeting people from all over the world, and really starting to think about what were my own independent values and what was the contribution I wanted to make to the world. I realized, like, oh, dancing is not what I want to do. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. I get a lot of joy from it. I got a lot of joy from it at that time, but I realized it's just, that's not the way I wanted to spend my time on this earth. And so, made that pivot, as a young person, when I was kind of figuring out the intersection of my values. And so I feel really fortunate to have made that pivot young, because it allowed me to, start my career from the very beginning in service.
Yeah, well, when I look at your resume and when I go through all these details that I know about your life, I always worry that people are going to think I'm a real weirdo that I know, but it's all in the name of research. But you did you worked at the Salvation Army, University of Alaska Anchorage, Alaska Conservation Foundation, and Abused Women's Aid in Crisis. And that's just a few of the many different organizations you've been involved with. And we could do 3 different podcasts just about that part of your career, but then you eventually decided to run for office. And I'd love to know about that process, because you were obviously doing so much important work and so much good work and making a difference. And you're obviously good at it when you see this resume, but the idea of going into public service when it's kind of it can be a nasty game, and it can be very unpleasant and very, very public, and versus, getting things done behind the scenes and whatnot. And so how did that become the kind of thing where you thought, all right, I got to do this. This is the next step.
Yeah. Well, I got there kind of an unusual way, because I still had 3 kids at home. I had 3 kids in high school.
Oh, wow.
In 2016. And so, I kind of toyed with the idea potentially of running at some point in time, but I just put that off on the side while, raising my family in partnership with my amazing husband, Troy, who was a fantastic co-parent with me. But in 2016, on Valentine's Day, my state house representative, Max Gruenberg, had a heart attack and he died. And, like most people in Alaska, I was, I heard this on the news and I read it in the newspaper. And do we still call them newspapers? They're not really papers anymore.
That's what I call them.
But it was a paper then. I literally had a physical paper then. And so we needed to find, Alaska, and our community in which I live in East Anchorage really needed to find somebody to replace him. And all of a sudden, like, my phone was blowing up. People were, elected officials were knocking on my door, recruiting me. People are asking me, would you consider this? Would you put in for this? And, I had a conversation with my husband, I talked with my family, I talked with some friends, and I'm just very mission focused. And, when I was at the Salvation Army, we were serving 34,000 Alaskans, making their lives better. And I'm proud of that. And that was really, really meaningful. And I loved my job, but serving the state of Alaska meant serving 730,000 Alaskans. And, so I got kind of curious about that. And my husband and I discussed whether or not it was the right time, knowing that it was definitely not a great time for our family. And we have 3 daughters. And, he said, we've got this. I've got this. Don't worry about it. And it will be really great for your daughters to see you lead in this way. And so, like, with the full support of my family, I was like, all right, what do I have to lose? Right. So I just tossed my hat in the ring. And 3 weeks later, I was appointed by the governor and sworn in.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that backstory. My research fell short there. That's amazing. That's no time at all. Did you almost think, I bet you there was probably points where you woke up in the morning and thought, wait, what just happened here?
Totally. Oh my goodness. When I showed up in the Capitol on that first day, I think I landed that morning and, went straight to the Capitol, on Thursday morning. Like I quit my job on Monday night after I got a call from the governor, and then I flew to the Capitol on Thursday. And after putting to bed my work, because I led a team kind of transitioning that work over, packing,
Yeah.
I had to move to Juneau and, showed up in the Capitol. I think it was about maybe 9:00 when I showed up. I could be wrong on that time frame. Anyways. And then I got sworn in. I went to the House floor and all of a sudden people were calling me Representative Spohnholz. I went from Ivy to Representative Spohnholz overnight. And it was like, oh my gosh, every day I was like, wow, this is just amazing, and also so amazing in all the best ways, It's a privilege to be in those conversations and to get to do that.
How politically active were you before that? Because when I I'm always the dumbest one on these calls that I'm doing, and so I can ask questions like this. But when I hear that, I just think about, obviously there's a huge life transition, being away from your family, just this massive thing. But then there's just the technical aspects of how does this job work? And, exactly what are the processes of government that allow us to move these things forward? And so how much of that did you know before you got there versus having to learn on the fly?
Well, I don't think that you are being dumb at all. You're asking really thoughtful questions here is what I think. And I appreciate that.
You're very nice and patient. Thank you.
I had always been involved in the sense of, like a donor and an occasional volunteer. I had volunteered for years, but I wasn't a party activist. I didn't follow the legislature. I wasn't that person. And so when I showed up, I had everything to learn. I had to learn about the legislative process. I had to learn about the dynamics of that. And a lot of folks were really generous and helped me with that. In fact, I remember the then House Minority Leader, Chris Tuck, and I were talking on the plane, and he said, "We're your new family now."
Wow.
And I was like, wow, well, I still have this other family, but yes, I have another one too. And it's true. There's a whole community of people that came through to support me. And I had an amazing chief of staff who had worked for Max Gruenberg, who I was fortunate to have stay on, who was my guide in this process because he'd worked in the legislature for years. And it was, I was able to be as successful as I was because of those really generous people that supported me.
That's wonderful to hear that. I think because I try to avoid the news and media, just standard kind of media stuff because it's also negative. And then when you hear stories like that, it restores hope in how things, how these systems work and that people are still good. And I don't know. I'm not obviously not from Alaska, but it seems that, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that there's some more camaraderie in Alaska, kind of like we're all in this together because of the, small population being very isolated, being, it's just tough living up there in a lot for a big part of the year. And do you feel like maybe compared to other states in that level of government that there's more of a, we're on the same team, we need to work together kind of thing? Or am I being overly optimistic there?
Well, the legislative process is definitely, it's structured conflict, right? And so by design, it's a way of navigating the creation of policy and transitions of ideas in a structured legal way that is very useful and serves us well in a lot of respects. But when it makes the news, when the legislative process makes the news, it only makes consensus doesn't make the news. Only conflict makes the news. And so what you miss in following the news, probably on the national level as well, and this applies to the national level as well, but this, I know for sure at the local level, is you miss the 100% votes in support of kind of routine things where there's a lot of consensus. There's only focus in on the few sort of conflict areas. So I think that, our media kind of overemphasizes the conflict and underemphasizes the areas of consensus and collaboration. But I do also think that Alaska we are a physically huge state. We're equal to 1/3 of the continental 48 states. Wow. And in terms of the scale, we have more coastline than the entire rest of the country. We've got 50% of the country's terrestrial carbon in our amazing state. We have 229 federally recognized tribes, indigenous tribes in Alaska. That's 40% of the tribes in the whole country. So we're just big and massive, but we have a small number of people, as you said. There's only about 730,000 of us, and we do kind of all have to stick together. And so we help each other out a lot. We help you. I mean, you can be anywhere and somebody will stop and help you fix your tire. If you have car trouble, people aren't going to leave you out in, it's pretty cold right now. It's about 0 degrees. Nobody's going to leave you on the side of the road here in Alaska. And the truth is, in the capital, across party lines, people were generous with me and very, very helpful. And that's where actually the work is in that space in the middle. And it's that negotiation and that consensus in the middle that is where the real problem solving is. And I don't think people know externally, but the number, I had dinner with just as many people of the opposite party as me, as with people that were in my same party on a, very regular basis, because that's where the work is done, is in that relationship building. And I think it's one of the things that I love about my current employer at the Nature Conservancy is we are also all about relationships and doing things at the speed of trust. And I think, doing things at the speed of trust is really, that's where you get big systems change. And that's a very Alaskan value.
Well, you read my mind, because as you were saying that, I was thinking that's, on all of these Nature Conservancy focused episodes I've had, that is the consistent thing that's come up over and over and over, is building relationships, building very solid relationships based on mutual trust. And it's just so, for all the cutting edge science and ecology and conservation solutions that TNC does, it all boils down to these amazing relationships. And so again, we could do a full series about your time serving, but I'd love to know, when did the TNC job enter your mind? Because I would imagine, and this is always, I'm talking to humble people, they play this down, but I would imagine you had plenty of different opportunities and plenty of ways you could have taken your career. So why conservation and why TNC is the next big step?
So I served in the legislature for 7 years, and during that time in 2019, we had this so in Alaska's an oil state, and we're a resource extraction state. People have been really uncomfortable talking, even though we're experiencing climate change at 2 times the rate of the planet as a whole, because we're positionally located on the globe, and the Arctic, it's 4 times the rate of the globe as a whole. People are reluctant to tackle climate because they're afraid that addressing climate means that, our state budget will be cut. We will lose jobs. Our state budget is about 50% right now funded by oil. That we'll lose jobs. The oil industry has been a big jobs driver for us for a really long time. And so, an astute politician would avoid the topic of climate change. And while I was working on things, behind the scenes, it wasn't a focus area of mine. I actually focused in on our fiscal issues and on healthcare. Okay. Fiscal issues and healthcare were things that I felt like would make every single Alaskan's life better.
Sure.
Going back to that mission focused and, trying to make sure that I was really making people's lives better now. I'm intensely practical. And so that's how I focused my time and energy. But in 2019, we had just record heat. We had record heat waves in Alaska, and in Anchorage, it hit above 100 degrees. It was mind blowing. That does not happen, my friend.
Yeah.
Anchorage is like a scorcher on a summer day in Anchorage is 72 degrees. I mean, that is not normal. And we had just a terrible wildfire season that year. And my husband and I went out to our cabin one weekend, and on the way back into town, I was going to try, go to work the next day. On our way back into town, we got stuck on one side of a fire. And it was a fire that, just ravaged the area around Willow, Alaska on my way to, which you probably drove right through that area.
Yeah, I did.
And we had to stay an extra night because we couldn't drive through. It wasn't safe. So we stayed another night, went back to our cabin, stayed another night. And then when we drove out the next day with a pilot car going through, it was like Mordor. If you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings movie,
sure, yeah.
Everything was just desolate. There was these black toothpicks sticking up out of the ground, which were, the remaining trees, and, the ash everywhere on the ground made it look like sand. It looked like sand there instead of this very lush forest. And it was smoking everywhere. And the smoke was terrible, and the air quality in Anchorage that year was so bad that they were telling people to stay inside, to, keep their doors and windows closed, which, like, summer in Alaska, you want to be out as much as you possibly can. And that summer I was just like, man, I have got to get off the bench on climate change. Like this is, and I always knew this was a really, really critical issue, but I just, at that moment, I was like, okay, this is my responsibility, not in my individual way, but this is my responsibility as a leader to, make big change. And so then in 2022, I chose not to run for re-election that year. I decided that I was going to pivot out of the legislature, wanted to go back to my roots a little bit and work in the nonprofit sector again. And when I was looking at organizations that I would work at, and I was exploring a lot of different options and a lot of different ways I could do the work, I was, I looked at the Nature Conservancy, who was hiring for somebody in the state director role, and I looked at the organization's values and the way it did work, and with, a strong commitment to partnering with Indigenous peoples and local communities. And I looked at the organization's ambitious 2030 conservation goals, which include some, pretty ambitious goals around climate. And I was like, wow, this is an organization that I could be a part of. And then I learned a lot about the work that the way that the Nature Conservancy had been working in Alaska in partnership with Alaska Native corporations and tribes and communities. And I was like, oh yeah, this is it. This is my home. That's where I want to go.
Yeah. Before I started this podcast, I used to do a lot of work in both the real estate business and the conservation world with TNC. And I was always so impressed with the little corner that I was dealing with. But through this podcast, I've gotten to know kind of all branches of the Colorado chapter. And now we're thankfully getting to spread out all over. And it's such an amazingly effective organization, but also I think the bipartisan aspect of it is more important now than ever. And I think that speaks to what you were saying about building these relationships across the aisle when you were in politics. So I was looking around on your website, and it looks like there are kind of three main priorities, and then tons of programs underneath those, but climate solutions and sustainable fisheries and resilient communities. And you were mentioning the work with Indigenous populations and Indigenous communities. And I would imagine that some of that falls under the resilient communities or into the resilient communities bucket. And I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about that work in more depth, maybe some success stories or maybe things that some challenges that you're trying to address in your tenure. But I'd love to just hear more about that.
Yeah, I love that you honed in on that because I think that's some of our most important work. So in Alaska, the land ownership is kind of interesting in Alaska. It's a little different than it is in other parts of the country. So, more than 60% of the state is federal, about 29% is state, and only about 13% is in private ownership. Most of that Alaska Native corporations. So in Alaska, with one exception, we don't have Indian reservations or indigenous reservations. Instead, in the 80s, we settled land claims issues by allocating lands and development rights to Alaska Native corporations and created a very sort of innovative system and structure for land management and use. And so we have to do our work here in very different ways. So we don't have as many preserves. In fact, we only have one preserve in the state of Alaska. We do some conservation easements in the state of Alaska, and we do those always in partnership with local communities. In fact, we collaborated with a few other environmental organizations, including the Conservation Fund and others around a conservation easement out in Bristol Bay in partnership with the Pedro Bay Village Corporation, and that's an Alaska Native corporation. And these corporations have a responsibility to produce value for their shareholders, but they also have a commitment to ensuring that their cultures can remain strong and healthy. And so partnering with them on projects like that is really great. And so Pedro Bay turned the conservation easement funds, that the sale of those conservation rights or the development rights, they turned that into a fund at the corporation that produces dividends to their shareholders on an annual basis. They turned it into essentially, a permanent fund for their shareholders, like an endowment, which I think is really cool and very, very innovative. And part of that project was associated with, ensuring that the fisheries out in Bristol Bay can remain, vibrant. It's the largest wild sockeye salmon fishery in the world out in Bristol Bay. It's just, Robert Ketchum back in the day had a book called Rivers of Life, and it's teeming with lakes and rivers, and it's just a magical place where people have been, harvesting fish for millennia, and they want to continue to be able to do that, and we want to support them in that effort. So there's this really kind of wonderful sort of win-win around, our organizational values of supporting and partnering with Indigenous peoples and local communities and conservation outcomes that I think that's the sweet spot where you get really strong durability, is when you're not doing something to a community, you're doing it with the community and you're, following their lead. And I think that's really powerful. And that's one of the things that's really important about our work in Alaska. The other kinds of work we're doing in Southeast includes community forest partnerships, where we're doing selective thinning to accelerate the regrowth of forest there. And we're contracting with local Indigenous communities and contractors to do that work, so we can make sure that people locally are benefiting from the jobs associated with that, among many other initiatives. Because in Southeast Alaska, the Tongass National Forest is there, and there were the timber wars in Southeast Alaska. We call them the timber wars for a very long time, which essentially pitted conservationists against local communities there in a way that wasn't really constructive, because those local communities were just struggling to find a way to make money to put food on the table. And as our, conservationists, we weren't always recognizing that we had to make sure that people could put food on the table before they could be thinking about extra things like, preserving and conserving lands and places. But we have been a part of efforts in Southeast Alaska for a very, very long time to, identify other ways of creating jobs and economic value in the community that supports conservation, because that is in line actually with Indigenous values. They want to continue to steward the lands and waters on which they've lived for millennia further, right? They had a 7-generation sort of philosophy. They're thinking 7 generations into the future to make sure that resources continue to be there for their children and their children's children and so on. And so there's this great alignment that if we think creatively about that, we can create these really beautiful, lasting, tangible outcomes. And some of our biggest successes have been in that work.
This may be kind of a random or weird question, but I'd love to know more about how you think about building relationships, because you strike me as somebody that is, you said you're very practical, very mission-based. You want to get stuff done. Time is of the essence. But at the same time, building these relationships with people that allow this work to happen, that there may be ways to speed it up, but it's kind of inevitably going to be a slow process, of people trusting the people from TNC or from, wherever. And so how do you balance this need or desire to move quickly, make things happen with the sometimes possibly slow realities of building very, very rock solid relationships, if that question makes any sense?
That makes absolute sense. And that's like the $1 million question there. That is the money question right there, right? Which is that we are always thinking about at the Nature Conservancy. And I wouldn't say that, no organization is perfect, and we're not perfect at that either, but we strive every day to do things the right way. We try so hard to do things the right way. And sometimes that means, slowing down, because you have to move at the speed of trust if you're going to create those lasting, tangible results that are so important to us. And I think as, my job as, a leader here within the Nature Conservancy and all across the leadership of our organization is to think about creating personal relationships, but also thinking about what are the dynamics that we need to shift and change to produce those lasting, tangible outcomes. And part of that is through relationship and engaging, and not allowing or supporting otherizing of people that gets in the way of solving problems, which, I believe is in the middle. You solve problems in the middle across difference. And often what is important to, multiple stakeholders, if you can reduce the inflammation and you can move out of the conflict zone and just kind of slow your roll a little bit and think about what are everyone's shared values and priorities, most often we have more in common than we have differences over. And it's not so much typically the what that is the issue, it's the how, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, when we were, and I say I need to rephrase that, when Alaska was struggling with the timber wars in Southeast Alaska, there was a lot of people were just operating in the conflict zone. Yes. They weren't spending a lot of time understanding one another. They weren't really spending time to figure out what was important to the other folks. And there was some really amazing work that the Nature Conservancy participated in and helped, support and champion from the beginning, called the Tongass Roundtables discussions, where, loggers and local communities came together with tribes and environmental organizations and just had conversations. And they just had to have a lot of conversation and to build kind of trust and respect. It took a little while, but they got to the point that now, for the most part, the macro level, timber wars are over, and there are still individual conflicts and challenges that come along, but the biggest conflicts have been sort of mitigated, mostly because when it came down to it, ultimately what everybody wanted was to be able to live in the beautiful places they call home. And Alaskans, regardless of kind of what side of the resource extraction issue you are on what side of the political equation you're on, even regardless of what community you live in, we love the land. We love the outdoors. We share so much. And if we can kind of spend time and get grounded in that space and start to really trust and understand the other, really understand the other person's, perspective, then it makes it easier to create that trust that you want, that you need in order to get to lasting, tangible outcomes. It is not easy and it is not fast, but my job as a leader is to support really amazing people that are on our team in developing those relationships and kind of thinking really strategically and to bring the resources that are needed to bear to tackle those complex issues.
I love that. And earlier you mentioned Bristol Bay, and I know that falls under the sustainable fisheries well and under resilient communities as well. And for people, I think most people who listen to this podcast will have heard of Bristol Bay, but I don't think they fully appreciate the power of Bristol Bay and how it's really just the salmon that come up through there are the foundation for so much of life and culture and economics and the ecological health just across the board, how much that bay and the salmon impact everything in Alaska. In a way, it reminded me of the grasslands of North America and how they affect economy through ranching. They affect carbon sequestration and clean air and clean water. And so I was wondering if you could just give the listeners a brief lesson on Bristol Bay and why that's so important to Alaskans and TNC.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's been really one of the joys of my job. And there are so many of them, but has been spending a lot more time out in Bristol Bay. I'd only been out to the Bay one other time previously before starting at the Nature Conservancy. And I've been able to go many times in the last, year or so and really get to know some people out there well. And it's such a privilege to be able to do that. Bristol Bay is this amazing place where, people have been living in harmony with salmon and the environment for millennia. There is 31 federally recognized tribes out in Bristol Bay representing 3 different indigenous cultures and language communities, which is really profound. When you land there, you are in indigenous country. It's really, really clear. And those rivers, the rivers of life, as Robert Ketchum called them, they are the waterways, they are the roads, they are everything. Like everybody rides a boat, everybody has a boat out there, everybody's, a commercial and or subsistence fisher person out in Bristol Bay. Like it is the heart of the economy in Bristol Bay. And it's what sustains communities and culture. It's a $2 billion salmon fishery.
Wow.
That is a lot of fish. It's half of the world's wild sockeye salmon.
That's crazy.
Half of the world's sockeye salmon comes from Bristol Bay. I went to the Bay this last summer and, I've been privileged to be able to spend time with Indigenous partners who are leading a coalition in support of that area. Just some really amazing leadership at United Tribes of Bristol Bay and others that has been really, really profound. It's been really wonderful for me to get to know them and to support them. And actually, I got to go to the White House this last year. And
did you really?
I got to see the president of United Tribes of Bristol Bay, Alana, speak in Yupik at the White House in the Rose Garden, introducing the president. That was epic. That was mind blowing. But when I went to Bristol Bay last summer, I wanted to go at the peak of summer when everybody was still fishing, so I could see what it was like, because I'd only been really in the down season when most people don't go, but that's the good time to talk with people.
Sure.
So, but I wanted to see when it was live and really hopping. And I have a friend and partner of our organization, Russell Nelson, who's chair of the Bristol Bay Native Corporation, who took me out in his plane that he shares with one of our board members, and he flew me over the bay. And there was 1,500 fishing boats in the water at that time.
Wow.
That is a lot of boats. I mean, it was like a traffic jam out on the water, but like spread out over a very large space. So it didn't feel crowded at all, but there was just so many of them. It was pretty amazing. And then I went to a fish processing facility that our board member, Norm Van Bacter, was running this last summer. And there was people from all over the world working in that fish processing facility. They had flags hanging from the ceiling of all the countries that people come from to work in the fishing industry at this one, fish processing plant alone. And I think it was like 59 countries, he said.
That's crazy.
This is an international resource, and we have a responsibility as, the world's largest environmental organization to help support the people that have always lived there and ensuring that fishery remains something that they can continue to count on for millennia in the future, that it doesn't go the way of many other salmon fisheries that we know about across the world, including in the Western U.S. And that's a really, really important and special thing. And I love the fact that the Nature Conservancy has identified, Bristol Bay as one of its top, priorities, because they understand the strategic value of this incredibly special place.
Well, I think anybody who follows outdoor news or even is on the Patagonia email list knows about Pebble Mine and that whole deal. And then that got shut down, which was a huge victory from everything I know. But what keeps you up at night worried about that? Like, what are the big threats in the future to Bristol Bay that that the average person down here in the lower states may not know about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple. One is the fact that, the value of the ownership of the fishing permits out there continues to leave the state. Every time there's a down year on the price of sockeye salmon, people, struggle, and they end up selling their boats and their fishing permits, and they go to somewhere else. And anytime you have ownership of a resource and separated from, the stewardship of it, you're going to run into strategic problems. So that worries me. The EPA's decision to deny the Pebble Partnership's Clean Water Act permit was very, very important, but it's not durable. It's not forever, right? And the state of Alaska has appealed that decision to the U.S. Supreme Court. I also think the thing that really keeps me up at night right now, to be honest, is climate and climate change and how climate is impacting fisheries. And right now, in the short term, climate change it's really bad for other fisheries. It's been good for Bristol Bay in the short term because Bristol Bay sockeye salmon, spawn in the cool lakes of the Bristol Bay area. And as the temperature has warmed just modestly to date in those lakes, it's actually made it easier for them to spawn. And that's the reason we've had record runs for the last 2 seasons. That will not last. And we know that fisheries all across the world and across the rest of the state of Alaska, to be frank, are threatened largely by climate change. There's other challenges as well. There's so many challenges in the fishing industry, including bycatch and many other really important issues. But if we, that metaphor about the person who's sort of, pulling the babies out of the water in the river.
Yeah.
I don't remember where that metaphor, what the tradition, where that metaphor came from, but essentially somebody is like catching the babies in a community or catching babies that are in the water, sort of pulling them out. And somebody gets the idea to go upriver and figure out who's throwing the babies in the water. And I think as it relates to fish in Alaska and also all the other subsistence foods that people count on, including caribou and moose and berries and all of the other things that people have been counting on for a very long time, as well as preservation of all of our amazing epic spaces that we have, they're not going to continue to be there if we don't tackle climate change. And, people are sort of, uncomfortable about doing that sometimes in the state of Alaska. And some people think that they have to make a choice, as I mentioned earlier, between tackling climate change and providing for their families. And I think we have a responsibility to figure out how to make it easier for people to provide for their families and be energy secure at the same time as making this transition that we need. And the Nature Conservancy is making big investments right now in helping to support the transition to renewable energy. And in Alaska, I'm really excited about that because we also have the highest energy costs in the country in Alaska.
Okay. Yeah.
And in a lot of communities, like all of Bristol Bay, the power and heat is provided largely either by wood or by diesel that's imported and used to power generators. Well, that is not a very, it's not a very good climate strategy. It's also super expensive. And so if you're just talking about like making people's lives better, if we can get more people on wind, solar, and hydro, like we're going to make people's lives better. Just like flat out, we're going to save them money. We're going to save individuals money. We're going to save communities money. We're going to save the government money that, the government that has to, operate schools all across our amazing state and all across our country. Like we could just make people's lives flat out better and tackle climate change at the same time,
That gets back to your practical streak. I mean, that makes, perfect sense.
You got it.
So if my math's correct, you're about almost 18 months into your job. What's been the biggest surprise for you? I mean, I knew you had certain expectations coming in, certain, big picture goals. What has been your biggest surprise, good or bad?
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I think knowing and experiencing moving at the speed of trust is, sort of very different. One of the biggest shift for me kind of culturally coming from the legislature where, we talk about very big ideas and we pivot from topic to topic to topic all the time and don't actually have to execute anything, right? Yeah. Because other people execute. The administration is doing that. Community members are doing that. Like our job is to understand the policy, the levers, and move those policies through the legislative process. Like moving into executing is a very big shift. And honestly, it's one that I'm really excited about because I think that there's really meaningful and powerful work, but it's also really, challenging and interesting. And as we're moving through this, we're moving through a moment right now at the Nature Conservancy of massive, cultural shift and change management as we're trying to meet this moment right now around climate and biodiversity loss. And we have some pretty ambitious goals in 2030, and that requires a lot of change management. Not everybody's as excited about change as I am. I love change. So, really just trying to make sure that we are moving at the speed of trust at the same time as we're continuing to sort of, challenge ourselves to meet this moment and to help our community know that we can make a difference. This is not futile. We don't need to just give up. In fact, there's so many wonderful opportunities to make our world a better, more vibrant place. And that is very exciting.
Would you call yourself a practical optimist?
Absolutely.
I think that's the best combo because you don't want somebody that's just so optimistic they got their head in the clouds, but you've got this perfect balance of optimism that gets people excited and you can see where everything's going, but you're very, very practical about how to get there. I love that. I need to adopt more of that in my life. You need to write a book.
No, my friend, I do not need to write a book, but I do love the kind of practical optimism and that is my mindset about the world. If we can find ways to, just like really meet people where they are and tackle problems in that way, that's where we're going to get so much done. And I think that's really exciting. That's how we're going to get the big systems change that we really need in order to meet this moment right now. So I think it's super, super excited. And I'm so glad that my practical optimism translated for you, because I feel like it's what's needed right now in this moment as we work to, tackle complex issues in conservation, but also in our world, right?
Yes.
And in our communities. We can't stop. We have to have conversations with people that are different than us. We have to understand them. We have to believe that we can make our world and our community a better place. And that starts with each and every one of us. In fact, Catherine Hayhoe, our chief climate scientist at the Nature Conservancy, says that one of the most important things, or if not the most important thing we can all do around climate, is to talk about it with people. And not in the sky is falling, but like, what can we do? Let's talk about the real practical impacts of climate change in our communities, and then start tackling it, just rolling up our sleeves.
Catherine, super inspiring. For people listening, if you're a new listener, you can go back almost exactly a year ago, and I had Dr. Catherine Hayhoe on the podcast, and it's one of the most inspiring and very practical as well about how to talk about climate change. I love that one. So I got two more questions for you. Since you refused to write a book, and I really, really think you should, I need other book recommendations. And it can be about conservation, it could be about Alaska, or it could be about leadership, service. Just, I'd love to know some books that have been important in your journey.
Oh gosh, I am a voracious reader, so
I thought you might be.
I love this question. I love to learn and to read. I got that from my mom too.
Yeah.
There's a few different things. There's a few different books. I mean, one, you mentioned Catherine Hayhoe, her book, Saving Us, the climate scientist case for hope and healing in a divided world. Amazing. There's a couple of other books that I think are really interesting and I think apply to conservation a little bit. There's one that was really interesting that hasn't gotten a lot of airplay, but I think it's fascinating. That was Arlie Russell Hochschild's book, Stranger in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And that was an amazing book. She's a sociologist who, worked at UC Berkeley and decided that she clearly didn't understand during the Tea Party time what was going on in other parts of the country. And she decided to get out there and learn about it. And that book was really, really insightful. And then right now I'm reading David Brooks' How to Know a Person, the art of seeing others and being deeply seen. And it's really remarkable. It's really remarkable if you're thinking about how to, deepen your relationships. I think that's good. And then I love Jim Collins' Good to Great and Brown's Fair to Lead. I mean, I just love those. Those are just, really guiding for me in a lot of ways.
I read David Brooks's, I think it was called The Third Mountain, maybe. I can't remember, but it was about this transition. It's kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of deciding when you want to do things that are bigger than yourself, and you want to, and I think you figured it out a lot sooner than I did, but I believe that's the name of it. We'll have links to all the books you mentioned and the correct name of that one in the episode notes. And final question, just anything you'd like to leave us with, any words of wisdom, anything you'd like to ask of the listeners. I think this has been so enlightening because we obviously talk a lot about conservation on this podcast, but it's mostly in the Western lower 48, and you're operating in such a different environment, but then at its core, so many of the principles are the same. And so any kind of words to wrap this up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, my parting words, hopefully there's some wisdom in them, would be, to dream big and then be relentless in the pursuit of that. Each of us has the opportunity to make the world a better place, to make the world more like what we wish it was. And too often we don't believe that we have agency to do something about it. And it's actually that belief, that false belief that we don't have agency, that we can't do something about it, that is actually the most dangerous to us. And instead, we need to really, truly believe that we can do something about it, because it's only then that we will actually accomplish that.
I love it. Ivy, this was so fun, so inspiring. Really, really great to chat with you. Thank you. I know you've got so much going on up there, and I just appreciate you taking time to chat with me and listen to all my crazy questions. But I hope that one day we can meet in person. But in the meantime, keep up all the great, important work up there that you and your team are doing.
Oh, thank you so much, Ed, for having me. I so appreciate it. Sometime when I'm down in Colorado, I'll send you a text and we can grab a beverage. And thanks for what you're doing for our community and our neighbors, and for the wonderful folks that are lucky enough to get to enjoy your podcast.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.